June 9, 1940. Yesterday must be the 9th day. It's been 3 weeks since we lost track of time, digging in, firing guns, changing positions, then it happens all over again. This time, however, the 12th Colonial Artillery Regiment is finally abandoning its defences on the Summer River. Malgashi obosniki, sheltering in the groves with their horses, hastily hitch guns and stack the charging boxes. The first battery, at a trot, leaves the site of Kachi, Villas, Bretonneau, where among the sad ruins left by the battles of the 14th year, we have been trying for 3 weeks to create a solid defence on the summer. Our guns rumbled for hours at the limit. Several guns, witnesses to the war of 1914-1918, burst. Many gunners were killed or wounded in the process. My cannon has 1917 written on it. I look at it. It resembles a one-horned ball set on wheels and coulter and spewing charges of buckshot. I bend over to check and correct the direction of fire, and I get a burn on my right cheek from touching the red-hot metal. And so the battle is over. On the night of June 9, the sky on our right is lit up with bright flames. The front in the direction of Peronna has been broken through. We find ourselves in danger of being surrounded by troops commanded by von Kleist and Rommel. Our 4th Colonial Infantry Division is ordered to cover the withdrawal. We move south, march a few kilometres and take up defences. The guns spit out their shells. We move on again, pass quite a bit, and again engage in battle under the settlements of Brache and Obuilla, which have already been captured by the German vanguards. The guns are unhitched and put into a fighting position right on the road and roadsides. We are firing direct fire, covering the infantry advance. There are 3 of us on the front of the 75mm gun. We are tightly pressed together. To my right, a short man with red hair and a freckled face. He speaks in a chant. His name is Jean Mech. He's the oldest of us, married for 3 years. A neat little fellow. He manages the supplies and rations for our small team of 1st Gun Crews of the 12th Colonial Artillery Regiment's 1st Battery. To my left is the jolly Jean Moyne, the youngest of us. He's just turned 20. He's from Nemours. Jean joined the army early in 1939, expecting to serve his conscription early, so he became a victim of circumstance. Yet at the depths of his large eyes you can read the surprise. He had dreamed of something very different in his 20s. I am 25. Like all enlisted men of my year, I have been in the service for about 4 years. Each of us has his duties at the gun. War brings to mind a vast factory where death is fabricated. Jean Moyne is the loader. His job is to feed the shell into the barrel with a rotating motion of the palm of his hand. Jean Mech is the shooter. He closes the bolt and, stepping a little to the side, sharply pulls the cord of the percussion mechanism. I am the gunner. Scale, drum, these strange words are the precise instruments by which I determine the direction of fire in relation to the rep. Then it is enough to turn the crank of the elevating mechanism, and the range is set. On this warm, sunny June day of 1940, we 3 young witnesses of the catastrophe are as if bound together by the gun rolling southward and sowing death. Across the plain, among the bread and beet fields, is moving toward Paris 10 to 15 columns scattered along the front. Infantry, horse artillery, sappers, Foreign Legion, Frenchmen, Malgashis, Moroccans, Senegalese follow in an indescribable disorder. Bitterness and fear can be read on their excited faces. Cannons, trucks, wagons, harnessed horses, overturned crates. All mixed up in a huge commotion, and Nazi planes, all this bombing machine gun fire. Having finished the raid, the Nazis scatter leaflets over our columns. The names of the small towns and villages through which we pass are etched in our memory. Gentel, Rouet, Mori, Coulomel, Menyeli, Ravenel, Liglantia, Crèvecoeur. There's something symbolic about it. The infantrymen cluster around charging boxes, cannons, wagons, or walk straight through the beet fields. On the Paris-Amiens road, a huge wave of people is rolling towards Paris. For 3 weeks now, women, old people and children have been fleeing the invasion on these roads, leading to nowhere. There are handcarts, baby carriages with hastily thrown some belongings in them, horse-drawn carts, and occasionally there are old cramped cars. Sometimes among the refugees, as if an alien from the other side of the world, appears a soldier with a wandering look, driven to exhaustion. He has survived the battles in Belgium and northern France. His weapons are long gone, and he can be distinguished from the refugees only by his tattered uniform. We have been sold. No one really knows how and for what. All sorts of stories about the 5th column are being retold. Some are similar to the truth, others are obvious exaggerations, and others are the product of pure fantasy. But the cry of the crowd, reaching for Paris, refers first of all to the rulers, to the officers of the general staff. We have been betrayed. We have only 3 guns. Captain Pierre Bellard is trying to save the remnants of his battery. He orders us to move along the roads parallel to the Paris-Amiens road. Pierre Bellard is a native of Marmande. In these days, when so much meanness is being discovered, particularly among the senior officers who in a few weeks will go to the service of the Vichy regime, our captain is an example of real courage. He adheres to principles that are unfamiliar to those whose adoration of the Mussolini and Hitler regimes and hatred of the Popular Front have driven them to the point of neglecting both their homeland and their duty as a French officer. After overcoming a few kilometres, we left the road leading to Saint-Just-en-Chaussee, and it seemed to us that we began to move faster. No sooner had we passed Saint-Martin-Hautebois, however, than we came under artillery fire. We turned off the road and dragged our gun into the garden. Through the hazel bushes we spotted a German battery. An artillery duel ensued. A German shell with a sharp whistle flew right over our heads, plunged into the loose garden soil 10 metres behind our position. Fortunately, the shell did not explode. Our first shot is a flight, but the second shell falls close to the German guns. Our fire is accurate, and the German guns fall silent. The column starts on its way again. After 1 or 2 kilometres at the gentle descent of the road Angevillers, Prandarua, we are met by German machine guns. Moving at the head of the column, Captain Bella and his driver were killed by the first machine gun burst. Wagons with guns turn off the road into the field. Soldiers jump off the front and run, hiding behind crates and trailers. Jean-Mec and Jean Moyne are caught off guard by machine gun fire. They seemed to freeze at the gun barrel and remained seated with their arms around their necks as if to protect themselves from the bullets. A bullet struck Jean Moyne directly in the temple, and he rolled under the cannon. Many other soldiers are killed and wounded. Through the fields we come to a small village called Livilla. We meet here with legionnaires, Senegalese, Moroccans, and learn that Nazi tanks have occupied a neighbouring village. "It's all over," says our Lieutenant Frugier, a teacher from the department of Haute-Vienne, conscripted from the reserves in September 1939. In the village where we are stationed is being shelled by the Germans. About 100 of our soldiers have taken refuge in some cellar. The time is approaching 1 o'clock in the morning. Together with 2 or 3 dozen soldiers, I decide to try to slip between the positions just occupied by the Germans. We got out of the cellar and headed towards a small forest. But then we were spotted by German sentries. Flares hung in the air. The machine guns started firing at once. We were forced to turn back. On the morning of June 10, when we heard the endless rumble of Hitler's troops moving on Paris, we became prisoners. The Nazis order us to stand along the wall of one of the farms and aim a machine gun at our formation. The Senegalese prisoners are immediately shot. After a brief pause that seemed like an eternity, we are lined up in a column and driven toward Tricot. Anyone who gets separated from the column, or does not keep up with it, is doomed to death. Some French soldier was killed on the road and left on the roadway. Not a single German truck or tank stopped, and the corpse was not removed. The body of the dead man was tormented by the wheels, and soon it turned into a bloody mass. A column of prisoners, among whom I was among them, had travelled more than 100 kilometres. Montdidier, Banom, Cambrai, and many other settlements were left behind. Along the way, brave women brought us bread and water in buckets. Nazi soldiers overturn the buckets with their rifle butts and rudely drive women, old people, and children away from the road. At times, the Nazis, amusing themselves, open fire on one of the prisoners as a target. All this happens in areas surrounded by barbed wire, where we are driven like cattle for the night. In Belgium, in Boren, we are loaded into an echelon, squeezing 50 people into a boxcar. We crossed to Germany, then Austria. Through the hearing wagon window, we notice on the building standing by the road, red with black spider flags. An armistice has just been signed. The Nazis are celebrating their victory. On the second day after the armistice is signed, we disembark from the echelon at the small station of Krems, near Vienna. We pass a small hillside and arrive at concentration camp 17B, located on the bare plateau of Nix-Endorf. Along the road are children waiting for the convoys to arrive. They throw stones at us. There are about 40 tarred wooden barracks in our camp. It is surrounded by 2 rows of 4-meter barbed wire fence with watchtowers along it. Designed for 12,000 people with beds in 3 tiers, the camp will at times hold up to 20,000 prisoners. We're starting a new life. We rise at dawn. Instead of coffee, we are given tinted water with saccharine. All its virtues are reduced to the fact that it is warm. At noon, we are given a concoction called soup. In a pot of warm slurry floats a few pieces of unpeeled potatoes, rutabaga leaves, and nettle stalks. In the evening, we are entitled to about 100 grams of bread with a piece of synthetic margarine. Lissome fleas abound in the barracks. Because of the lack of food and tobacco, some prisoners lose their human form, throwing into a fight because of a cigarette butt thrown by a German sentry. From the first battery, there are only 5 of us left, and we try to stick together. One morning, we were among several hundred prisoners who were driven up a slope to the station in Krems. There, we were loaded into freight cars and sent to Wheels. Outside the town, a large shed surrounded by barbed wire was prepared for the prisoners. From here, the prisoners were sent in groups to construction and other work. Our group of 24 men was assigned to repair the railroad track. We were hardly fed, and it became more and more difficult to work. The German road foreman was always hanging around us. He has only one word on his tongue: work. The prisoners answer him: no bread, no work. If our relations with him are far from friendly, they are brotherly with the majority of Austrians working here. Among the Austrians, one stands out. He is about 60 years old. He is a communist Hoffman. He studied us for several weeks without showing any sign of it, and then he was the first to bring us bread, despite the official prohibition of the guards guarding us. This dull life stretched on through all the days of July, August, and September 1940. Longing for France and for those you love. Hunger, parasites, heavy sleep on wooden bunks. On Sundays, some of the prisoners head to church. The rest do laundry or rest. Every Sunday, 40 of us gather in the courtyard and sit in the sun. We discuss issues of interest to us. The reasons for France's defeat in the war, our immediate tasks, methods of action, the international situation, on which our fate now depends, to immediately come to a common agreement. To work for the Nazis as little as possible, to pretend to work, not to be part of the Nazi death machine. On a September Sunday afternoon, an Austrian man appeared in front of the barbed wire on the side opposite the guard post and signalled us to come closer. 2 other workers approached. One of them greeted us by raising his clenched hand in a fist. This is the anti-fascist greeting Rothfront. Another Austrian tossed us several round loaves of bread. The figure of a 4th Austrian loomed in the distance. No doubt he is ensuring the safety of his comrades. Anti-fascist solidarity is not at all empty words. It had a strong effect on all prisoners of war that day. The bread was divided into endless portions. It was welcome, but the most important thing, of course, was that it boosted our morale. We were not alone. Even in Austria and Germany, those fascist citadels, there were courageous people who did not bow their heads to Nazism. The winter of 1940-31 came. It was brutal in this barracks in Wales. Hunger and vermin were joined by cold. In the first months of 1941, our group was sent to build a grain elevator. Every morning the guards took us to the construction site. After arriving at the place of work, we lined up against the rabbit cages. Immediately a man in his 40s with a Hitler Party badge on his lapel appeared. He had bread in his hands. He slowly cut off pieces from the loaf as if he was going to distribute the bread to us, and then slowly opened one by one the cages and fed the rabbits. After this ceremonial, we were ordered to start carrying the cement up the steep stairs. It was forbidden to use the hoist. One day I had a sharp confrontation with a Nazi foreman. At noon, I was climbing the ladder with a heavy load of cement on my back and was approaching the top of the elevator. In response to a question about where to put the cement, the foreman signalled me to wait. The wait lasted 5 or 10 minutes. I was seized by a sudden rage. I unbuckled the straps and threw the cement at the foreman's feet, grabbed him by the collar and began to shake him, cursing furiously in French and German. The Austrian labourers were watching all this. Without waiting for the foreman to come to his senses, I went downstairs and went to the non-commissioned officer in command of the guards. This time he fortunately turned out to be a Viennese student who spoke French. I told him about the skirmish and the countless taunts we had been subjected to. Speaking on behalf of all my comrades, I told him in an emphatic tone, "We are prisoners of war, not slaves." I was not punished by any of the camp authorities, and soon we were spared the rabbit show and allowed to use the hoist. During the last few months, the atmosphere changed somewhat. Instead of the apathy that had gripped the prisoners, signs of mental uplift began to appear. Few people took at face value the propaganda claims of the newspaper trade union which the Nazis published, especially for us with the help of a few French collaborators. I made myself a bag with straps, like those worn by the Tyrols. For this I used a mattress cover from a straw bale, which I boiled with nettles, as was often done during my childhood in Corrèze, when they dyed Easter eggs. The sack had taken on a greenish tint, and at a quick glance could pass for a genuine Austrian peasant's sack. Then, day after day, I carried the canned goods, the sack, the work clothes to the construction site and hid it all under a pile of scaffolding. Another prisoner of war, my comrade Apollinaire Loiseau, who came from Formai, also wanted to escape. At the end of April, the weather seemed to be fine. We decided to set off on the 1st of May, thus celebrating the big day. We had never worked for the French masters before, nor were we going to do it for the Nazis. At noon, when everyone had gathered for lunch, we hid in the grain elevator. Then, with sacks behind us, we climbed over the fence and each took our own route toward the Swiss border. I had a primitive map. I was going to walk 200 kilometers. To throw off the pursuit, I went north, intending to find a place where I could wait for the night. After walking a few kilometers, I found myself in a very dense forest, apparently. It was a hunting reserve of local large industrialists, stretched out in an almost impenetrable thicket. I spent the rest of one of the most unusual days of my life here. There was a small clearing nearby. Birds came here without fear, hopping among the leaves, brushing their feathers. Fallow deer and fawns frolicked around me, and squirrels raced through the trees from branch to branch right above my hiding place. I could observe all the hidden life of the forest. As night fell, I set off in the direction of Switzerland. Alas, the beautiful sunny weather changed by evening. A heavy downpour had begun. For a whole week I slept in the dense forest during the day, and when night fell in the rain I set off again. One morning I felt that I could not go any further unless I found a shelter where I could dry my clothes. The Tyrolean shepherds usually stack their hay on the mountainside, far from any dwelling, and build board sheds over it. I crawled under one of these sheds and hung my clothes on a beam. It rained all night. I can still hear the drops hitting the canopy then. Late in the morning, an Austrian peasant, obviously working nearby, came to rest under the canopy. I burrowed into the hay, but he noticed my stuff. He had a pitchfork and moved toward me with a threatening look. I had to come out of my hiding place and get dressed. I made an attempt to stir up the peasant's human feelings by showing him a photograph of my first son, born when I was already a prisoner, but the peasant was unyielding, started shouting and gathered the surrounding villagers. Some time later, the gendarmes took me back to the concentration camp, where I was placed in a barracks for escapes. In May 1941, there were about 300 escapes like me in concentration camp 17B. The number of escapes speaks for itself, confirming a certain evolution in the moods of many prisoners. After 3 weeks in solitary confinement, where I was fed once every 3 days, that was the price of the first escape. I established contact with an underground organization and soon became its leader, together with a Parisian communist. In the camp, as in peacetime, he worked as a barber. The organization numbered about 150 people, divided into small groups. Under the floor of one of the barracks, we managed to install a radio receiver. After Germany made a treacherous attack on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, we often caught broadcasts from Moscow and listened to reports about the Soviet troops' military actions. All prisoners of war, regardless of their views and social status, began to realize that new prospects were opening up, that finally a way out of the situation could be found in the defeat of the Nazi army. However, it was not enough to hope that the USSR would decide our fate through its struggle. We had to act ourselves. The best way to proceed was to escape from the camp. One could love the Soviet Union, or have no sympathy for it, or hate it. But no Frenchman worthy of the name could in these days wish victory to those who held France under their heavy boot, and could not but wish victory to the Soviet Union. On the other hand, we could not content ourselves with merely flying small flags and waiting for the Russians or the British to bring us freedom. We had to make some contribution to this great battle of nations for freedom. It was about the future of France. There's your bear again. Now you see what he's done to us, your bear? Commander, I don't know what you're talking about. Come into my office. This figurative conversation took place around August 25–6, 1939, in the Dubois-Tainville barracks in Chouinville. The talk was, of course, about the USR and the non-aggression pact it had just signed with Germany. In the commander's office, I first tried to excuse myself by saying that a second-class soldier had no right to engage in politics. Seeing the persistence of the commander, I tried to tell him my point of view about the non-aggression pact. During my military service, I had several serious clashes with commanders. We had to organize speeches of soldiers of the regiment with demands for better nutrition and even managed to achieve tangible results in this case. The order to postpone demobilization, issued after the Munich Agreement was signed, caused a real demonstration by the soldiers, which did not please the regimental commander. We then laid large wreaths of red flowers at the foot of the monument to the victims of the war, and the red colour of the wreaths was not at all intended to emphasize the political affiliation of those who laid the flowers. I was under special surveillance. The registration card reads, Member of the National Bureau of the Union of Communist Youth. It was for this reason that in the room where I lived with other soldiers, a senior corporal was placed, who was obliged to report my behaviour to the battery commander every morning. On March 26, 1939, the soldiers of my year of enlistment were assembled in the Dubois-Tainville barracks. They immediately tried to isolate me from my peers. Most of the soldiers who had already served their time were assigned to the 3rd Battery. I was forced to start all my classes again, as if I were a new recruit. By this injustice, the reactionary officers, in short, fascists, wanted to separate me from my comrades and provoke me. The commander was different from them. Not unlike the other officers, he was courteous in his treatment of me. What kind of man was he? I must admit that even now I still find it difficult to answer this question. It seemed to me that on that day he simply wanted to know the opinion of a communist on the German-Soviet pact. This diplomatic act, which made a great deal of noise and is now receiving a variety of assessments, was indeed an event of paramount importance. The banning of humanity, CSOA, and the entire communist press deprived us of the opportunity to make the clarifications that many had been waiting for. As in all upheavals, a certain part of the people renounced their party and their ideals in connection with this pact. Another part of people trusted the pact, but being unable to orient themselves in the complicated situation, waited for clarifications. There were, of course, people who realized that the pact was the logical result of the events we had experienced during the last 3 years. Personally, due to the coincidence of certain circumstances, I was prepared for a correct understanding of this serious international decision. When I was 17 years old, 2 men opened the way for me to communist ideas, Henry Barbesset and Romain Rolland. My father had died in the First World War, and I had hated war from my childhood years. In 1932, not belonging to any political party, I wholeheartedly accepted the call of Henry Barbes, Romain Rolland, Heinrich Mann, Maxim Gorky, Einstein, Anton Sinclair to convene a World Anti-War Congress in Amsterdam. Later I took part in the Pleyel Congress, which was to establish a committee of unity and struggle against war and fascism. As head of the French youth movement against war and fascism, and soon afterward as a member of the Bureau of the Union of Communist Youth, I closely followed the development of the international situation, which was becoming more depressing and dramatic every month. Every day in the first columns on page 3 of Humanite, Gabriel Péry analyzed the present and coming major problems of international politics in his splendid articles. Then, when he was thrown into prison, he wrote that he tried to be objective in his judgments. In March 1939, a few days before I was to be drafted into the army, I was to hold a meeting in Tarara. At that time, the trip from Lyon to Tarare was quite time-consuming. One had to take the local train, which stood for long periods of time at each station. It was on this day was published the report of Stalin at the XVVI Congress, Stalin at the XVUE, I Congress of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks. On the journey from Lyon to Tarare, I had enough time to read and take notes on this report, which was of fundamental importance for those who wanted to understand the essence of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. The war is being waged by aggressor states, in every possible way infringing upon the interests of non-aggressive states. First of all, England, France, and the United States, and the latter are heeling back and retreating, giving the aggressors concession after concession. Thus, before our eyes, there is an open redistribution of the world and spheres of influence at the expense of the interests of non-aggressive states, without any attempt to repel, and even with some connivance on the part of the latter. Us bourgeois politicians, of course, know that the First World Imperialist War gave victory to the revolution in one of the largest countries. They fear that the Second World Imperialist War may also lead to the victory of the revolution in one or more countries. But this is not the only or even the main reason now. The main reason lies in the refusal of the majority of non-aggressive countries and, above all, of England and France from the policy of collective security, from the policy of collective repulsion of aggressors, in their transition to the position of non-intervention to the position of neutrality. Formerly, the policy of non-intervention could be characterized thus: let each country defend itself against aggressors as it wants and as it can. Our business is the side. We will trade both with aggressors and with their victims. Stalin said, continue. Or, for example, take Germany. They ceded Austria to her despite the existence of the obligation to protect its independence, ceded the Sudetenland, threw Czechoslovakia at the mercy of fate, violating any and all obligations, and then began to screamingly lie in the press about the weakness of the Russian army, about the decay of Russian aviation, about the turmoil in the Soviet Union, pushing the Germans further east, promising them an easy prey and saying, "You only start a war with the Bolsheviks, and then everything will go well." We must recognize that this is also very similar to pushing, to encourage the aggressor. In Stalin's report to the XVIE Congress of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, held in March 1939, after assessing the current situation, the following tasks of the All-Union Communist Party in the field of foreign policy were: 1. To continue to pursue a policy of peace and strengthening business ties with all countries. 2. To be cautious and not to let our country be drawn into conflicts by war provocators who are accustomed to take the heat with other people's hands. 3. To strengthen the fighting power of our Red Army and the Red Navy. 4. Strengthen international ties of friendship with the workers of all countries, interested in peace and friendship between peoples. In his report to the Congress, Stalin spared neither the Nazis nor their henchmen. The report was a serious warning to the French and British rulers that by engaging in political manipulation and pitting Hitler against the Soviet Union, they risk not raking up the heat with other hands and burn their hands. Even in the March days of 1939, the main direction of Soviet policy continued to be the policy of mutual assistance to repel aggression. There was still an opportunity to fundamentally change the foreign policy that had hitherto been pursued by the British and French rulers. An anti-Hitler military alliance was desirable and necessary, and therefore, for the sake of saving the world, the Soviet Union ardently sought a united front against Hitler. If, in spite of everything, war would break out, this military alliance would ensure the conduct of hostilities with minimal losses, in favourable conditions of the situation, with the aim of destroying the military machine of the realm. But the inexorable march toward the abyss continued. The British and French rulers in relation to Hitler for many years pursued a policy of appeasement of the aggressor, if not stronger. On March 16, 1935, in violation of international agreements, Hitler proclaimed the revival of the German army without the slightest opposition from France and England. On March 7, 1936, several German battalions captured the Rhineland, but the French headquarters and the French government were not even alarmed. In 1936-1939, Hitler and Mussolini made direct military intervention in Spain, sent soldiers, pilots, tanks and airplanes there. At the same time, the British and French rulers, under the pretext of so-called non-interference, refused to give, even for money, weapons to the only legitimate Republican government. Some documents seized after the end of the war bring heavy indictments against the English and French rulers for their position before 1939. Here is one of them. Notes taken by Hitler's personal interpreter, Schmidt, during a visit to the Führer by the English Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, in November 1937. The meeting took place at Hitler's personal residence in Obersalzberg. Halifax began by recognizing on behalf of the British government that the successes which had been achieved by the Führer were not confined to Germany alone, that by destroying communism in his own country he would bar its way into Western Europe, and therefore there was every reason to regard Germany as the bastion of the West against Bolshevism. This statement was the basis of the negotiations and found the Führer's enthusiastic approval. "Only Bolshevism is a catastrophe," he remarked. "Everything else can be settled." Halifax was of the same opinion. He declared that the English government was prepared to make serious concessions. "In England," he said, "the opinion at this time is that the existing temporary misunderstandings can be entirely avoided." After recalling the problems of Africa and Asia, of which, as Viceroy of India, he was very well aware, Halifax turned to the situation in Europe and said, "All other matters are characterized by the fact that they concern changes which will sooner or later take place in Europe. Among these are Danzig, Austria, and Czechoslovakia." The above issues were quickly resolved. On March 12, 1938, German troops entered Vienna. Undermined by the activities of the Nazi Ziesisin Court Party, Austria surrenders without a fight. On March 13, Austria officially joins the German Reich. The British and French rulers offer no resistance, making only a few utterly fruitless protests. Having swallowed Austria, predatory Nazism sets its eyes on Czechoslovakia. Part of its territory, the Sudetenland, was home to a German-speaking population. The Nazi Party Sudeten Germans, under the leadership of Henlein at the behest of Berlin, is processing the masses. On September 15, no longer Lord Halifax, but Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of the British Royal Government, pays Hitler a visit, this time in Berchtesgaden. On September 23, Chamberlain meets with Hitler again. The Czechs prepare for resistance. On the same day, September 23, they announce a general mobilization. But Chamberlain, still September 15, conceded before Hitler's blackmail, agrees to new concessions as soon as Hitler raises his voice. A widespread campaign of intimidation is waged on the radio, in print and in the movies. The newspaper Action Française also joined in this campaign, with the slogan "Down with War" printed in large print on the front page. Only Humanite and a few other small circulation newspapers, such as Émile Buret's L'Ordre, Henri de Carinis' L'Époque, and L'Aube, the organ of the social Christians, raised their voices against the betrayal of the interests of the Czechoslovak nation. On September 24, when the British and French rulers have already decided the fate of Czechoslovakia, the French government mobilizes a number of conscripted ages. On September 26, the British Navy is placed on alert, followed by the mobilization of 6 conscripted ages in Belgium. On September 29, Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and Daladier signed the infamous Munich Agreement. They gave up not only territories with German-speaking populations, but also a vast area of Czechoslovak defensive fortifications. On September 22, 1938, Humanity put in the headline. Let us quote again the dreaded saying of Winston Churchill. "The answer to dishonor would be war." A23. We need to wash away this dishonor. September 24. France's statements will not be trusted as long as they are made by the man who gravely violated them. We must reverse them. We must tear out of our history the terrible page written by 2 criminal ministers. September 26. We shall soon learn whether or not the French ministers have abandoned their disgraceful adventurism, whether they have prepared us for the ignominy of engaging us in war, or whether they intend to organize a resistance destined to save the world. However, the vast majority of the misled people believe that Daladier and Chamberlain are the saviors of the world, and on October 5, 1938, Hitler's Munich Diktat was ratified with 535 deputies voting in favor. 75 deputies voted against it. Among the 75 deputies who voted against ratification were 73 communists. The socialist Jean Boet from the Department of Côte d'Ar and Henri de Carinis, a right-wing deputy from the constituency of Neuilly. Nowadays, no one would boast of being a Munichite or espousing similar views. But in 1938, apart from the communists, no political party realized that the Munich Agreement was fraught with war and the enslavement of peoples. We communists were isolated. We were labeled militant because we wanted to prevent war leading to enslavement and disgrace, and to fight back against Nazism on an international scale. The enemy for the rulers of a number of countries was not fascism but communism. On October 4, 1938, the day before the vote in the Chamber of Deputies on the ratification of the Munich Agreement, Gabriel Péry showed in a remarkable speech the seriousness of this act and its terrible consequences. The Czechoslovak barrier, covered the outlets to the Danube Basin, the Balkans, and Asia Minor. This barrier protected not only the Czechoslovaks but also the French. You destroyed it in 3 meetings. You sentenced Czechoslovakia to economic strangulation. You sentenced it to total surrender to Germany together with its jealously kept secret Maginot Line. Do not try to assure us that by this you guarantee the borders of a crippled and divided country. You were incapable of defending Czechoslovakia, allied with the USSR and having reliable means of defense. Even more, you will be incapable of defending it, cut down and disarmed. You have committed a more serious crime. You have destroyed the basis which gave strength to democracy, the trust of the peoples. You have demonstrated to the whole world that it is imprudent and even dangerous to be a friend of France. When you come back with such documents in your suitcase, it would be natural to apologize or try to make amends. But it is quite impermissible to behave like a winner. Emphasizing that the Munich Agreement would not only fail to save the world, but, on the contrary, make war almost inevitable, Gabriel Perry sharply accused Eladia. You have signed the death warrant of an albeit crippled, but freedom-loving nation. The fact was that the non-interference in the affairs of Spain and the rejection of the programme of the Popular Front generated in the people's despair. The newspaper La Tribune de Genève wrote on this occasion, "In the face of the Popular Front, France had a certain strength, confirming the true and deep unity and cohesion of the French people, which was able to defend the independence of France against the encroachment of international fascism. After the signing of the Munich Agreement, the military danger began to increase at a more rapid pace. On October 2, Poland, under the dictate of Colonel Beck, occupied the Teschen district, where the national Polish minority lived. After the forced demobilization of the Czechoslovak army, Hitler placed one of his creatures, the pro-fascist Bishop Joseph Tiso, at the head of the independent Slovak state on October 7. German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop and Italian Foreign Minister Count Ciano issued an arbitration verdict on November 2, 1938, ruled by the fascist Horthy. Hungary received 12,000 square kilometers of Czechoslovak territory with a population of 1 million people, of which only about half were Hungarians. The wolves were tearing Czechoslovakia to pieces. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, which had been at the head of the resistance movement against the Nazis, was outlawed on September 28, 1938. Having gone underground, it fought until 1945. On March 15, 1939, Hitler's troops entered Prague. The German army occupied Bohemia and Moravia, and a so-called protectorate was established. Czechoslovakia was blotted off the map of Europe, and this met with no pushback from the French and British rulers. In France, there were men left in military service who, like myself, were approaching the time of demobilization. And yet, apart from fruitless protests, nothing was done. Hitler enjoyed the same freedom of action as he had in the Rhineland, in Spain, in Austria, in the Sudetenland. General Beaufort, whose political views are well known to readers of Le Figaro, defined the disastrous consequences of Munich as follows. France's military ally, the main link in Fox's strategic doctrine, is now broken, and this has been done not without the assistance of the large democratic states. Hitler's success is enormous. He has achieved not only the decommissioning of Czechoslovakia, but also that France has lost the confidence of its allies. The Little Entente has completely disintegrated. The USSR does not take part in negotiations and in solving issues of European politics. Poland and Hungary have profited at the expense of foreign territories and solidarized with the new order. In military terms, Hitler's benefit is also huge. 40 Czech divisions are captured with all their military equipment, and this is enough to arm 40 German divisions. Thus, the German gain amounted to 80 divisions, and this is equivalent to the entire French army. Today we know that if Britain and France had rejected the Munich Diktat, everything could have changed. Hitler would have been forced to retreat. The testimony of Wehrmacht Chief of Staff Field Marshal Keitel at the Nuremberg trials irrefutably confirmed. Was Germany prepared for World War at the time of the negotiations in Munich? Keitel: No, since we had not made any strategic and tactical preparations up to that point. If France and England had not accepted the Munich proposals, would Germany have struck with a large force? In my opinion, this is almost impossible. As I have already said, at that moment we were not prepared for war, especially if France had fulfilled her obligations towards Czechoslovakia. Did the Munich Agreement pursue the political aim of eliminating the Soviet Union from European affairs? Yes, of course. Czechoslovakia was regarded as a military base for the Soviet Union, with all the extremely dangerous consequences that this entailed. During this period, it was the Soviet Union that did everything possible to save Czechoslovakia and organize a repulse against the aggressor. Ivan Maisky, who at that time was the Soviet ambassador in London, gives a number of accurate information on this issue. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of the USSRM, on September 2, 1938, Litvinov told the French chargé d'affaires in Moscow that the USSR government, in the event of a German attack on Czechoslovakia, will fulfill its obligations under the Soviet-Czechoslovak Pact of Mutual Assistance in 1935 and will provide Czechoslovakia with armed assistance. A few days later, writes Maisky, Stalin through him brought to the attention of President Beans of the Czechoslovak Republic that the Soviet Union was ready to give Czechoslovakia armed assistance even if France did not do so. Even a historian like Maurice Beaumont, who cannot in any way be suspected of sympathizing with the USEA, found it possible to write, an implacable opponent of Nazism. The Soviet Union acts as a very powerful factor in the struggle against German aggression. During the Sudeten crisis, it pursued an absolutely correct policy. It declared that it was ready to fulfill its obligations to the end. This honest position is backed up by a clear intention to repel Hitlerism, which is loudly announcing a new march to the east. Such a cry applies fully to both French and British leaders who are pursuing a policy of freedom of action in the east. There is all sorts of talk about the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, but the Franco-German Pact signed in Paris on December 6, 1938, is shamelessly forgotten. The French Yellow Book published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs includes the text of this diplomatic document, as well as the statement of Georges Bonnet at a reception at the Quai d'Orsay of the statement of German Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop. Two ministers, Jean Zay and Georges Mandel, were not invited to the reception because they are Jews, and this could have spoiled the mood of Hitler's envoy. Bonnet itself. I am happy and proud that we have signed the Franco-German Declaration, which solemnly recognizes the existing borders and puts an end to a long historical dispute, opening the way to cooperation, designed to contribute to the development of the conviction that there is no natural dispute between the two states, which could jeopardize the peaceful basis of their relations. We also know that the French minister had an intimate conversation with von Ribbentrop at the Hotel Kriegen, assured him of his full support for freedom of action in the East, and, if necessary, of his readiness to give material assistance. This resembled a blissful optimism, boiling down to the following. Hitler will now go against the Soviet Union. We will watch his adventure with full approval. The French ambassador in Berlin, Coulondre, told Georges Bonnet on December 15, 1938. I am convinced that the Third Reich's desire for expansion in the East is as reliable a fact as Berlin's refusal, at least for the present, to make any conquests in the West. The latter follows inevitably from the former. The lyrical Coulondre continue. German dynamism will not stop before any difficulties, and the military districts are already talking about a march as far as the Caucasus and Baikal. So much for German dynamism. It was the middle of May, 1939. Already the collapse of our country was near, but the French rulers still pursued a policy of concessions to the aggressor. On March 23, 1939, Germany occupied Memel and Lithuania. On April 7, 1939, Italy attacked Albania and captured it in a few days. Document No. 149 of 1.7 1939, published in the French Yellow Book, contains an account of a conversation between Georges Bonnet and the German ambassador in Paris, Count Welchek. I finally told the ambassador that he could see for himself that there was a movement of national unity in France. Behind the back of the government, elections would be cancelled, popular assemblies banned, all attempts at hostile propaganda suppressed, and communist resistance would be broken. All this needs no comment. General Belfort testifies. Now that the former friendship has been restored, it is time for optimism and self-blindness. Why not push Germany to the east? We ourselves will cultivate our beautiful huge garden. This is a task we can do. In the euphoria promoted by Abetz's propaganda and Ribbentrop's visit, we nurture the hope of a possible continuation of a pleasant and sweet life, as if nothing were threatening us. Of course, the anti-fascists and some old-fashioned patriots are crying out for scandal and difficulties. Well, what is most disturbing is that the extreme right, seduced by Hitlerism, is harping on the necessity of jointly achieving the goals set by Germany and cultivating in us its methods. Why the unrest? History, however, was crystal clear. Hitler had answered all questions in his book Mein Kampf. People of one blood belong to one empire. The Reich, as a state, must unite all Germans and set as its task the conquest of their dominant position. Once the Reich has united all Germans, and if its territory proves insufficient to feed them, then from the needs of this people will naturally arise the moral right to seize foreign lands. And the vital space lies in the east, in Russia and in the neighbouring countries dependent on it. We shall stop the eternal march of the Germans to the south and west of Europe, and turn our eyes to the east. And to proceed to this stage of conquest, Hitler defines the order of accomplishing his intended goals. Germany must not fall into the mistake made before the war, turning the whole world into its enemy. She should know who is the most dangerous enemy, and strike a concentrated blow at him with all her forces. Who is this enemy? Hitler calls him. The mortal enemy, the ruthless enemy of the German people was and remains France. It goes without saying that it is possible to justify the necessity of settling accounts with France by covering its rear in order to settle its people in Europe. And it does not matter who rules or will rule in France, let it be the Bourbons or bourgeois Jacobins, Republicans, clerics or red Bolsheviks. The mortal enemy was and remains France. This text was read by Marie Therese on October 11, 1936 in Strasbourg at a mass meeting. On the need to repel the growing external threat. The General Secretary of the Communist Party spoke as early as 1936. In July in Amiens, August 6, at a meeting of communists in Paris, the union and reconciliation of the French nation, a front of the whole of France, superior to the Popular Front, including communists, socialists and radicals, joined by Christians and patriots of all political views, right and left. It is this union that the communists propose. It is what is necessary to save our country and the world. It is quite understandable that against the realization of these proposals, a fierce struggle was launched by the fascists, and not only by them. I recall the traditional demonstration at the wall of the Paris Communards, where socialists of all stripes, Trotskyists and other leftists met a column of young communists with the slogan, "Down with the communists." The so-called ultra-revolutionaries aligned themselves with the Munichites, and even with the fascists, admirers of Hitler and Mussolini. General Beaufort writes, in a depressing shuffle, left-wing parties are renamed militarist parties and accused of immitancy, while nationalists are repainted as pacifists by all means. Nationalists, who didn't just pretend to be them before 1939. This did not prevent them from going into the service of foreign invaders, although some of them became members of the resistance. Collaborationism nevertheless drew strength from among the pre-war so-called nationalists who were seduced both by Hitler and Mussolini, and by attempts to create joint Franco-German industrial cartels. A nation, pure deception when such people speak in its name. A nation is a people who create all wealth and shed their blood when required to defend personal and common freedom. The word nation was born on the battlefield with the Republic, liberty, and the slogan, "Long live the nation," was the cry of the Jacobins and the Sansculottes of 1789 and 1792, and of the volunteers at the Battle of Valmy who destroyed the monarchical coalition. A nation is a people, and the nationalists, coming from the milieu of big businessmen like Hitler's boot, better Hitler than the Popular Front, is the slogan of the big businessmen who are unable to digest the social changes achieved by the Popular Front. Nazism seduces the extreme right and merges with them. The vast majority of the right wing envies the regime of Hitler and Mussolini. The radicals and socialists smuggle together with renegades from the communist and socialist parties like Doriot and D to play on the peaceful aspirations of the French to draw them into war, into slavery. "We don't want to die for Danzig," Dia wrote. Vomitous pacifism. It is what led us to war like sheep to the slaughter. It is what drew certain people into this camp. The Secretary of the National Teachers' Union, André Delmas, has the fearless words, "Better slavery than death," and this was his position that led to both. During the Nazi occupation, the resistance fighters spoke under the slogan of the revolutionaries of 1792. Freedom or death. Our principle was the definition of France's role given by the historian Jules Michalak. The inspiration of 1792, the miraculous young banner, the splendid young generals whose death was mourned even by the enemy, the impeccability of Marceau, the nobility of Gauche, the even more sublime glory of our sovereign assemblies, the peaceful and truly humane spirit of the people at the turn of 1789. These were the conditions under which France sacrificed herself for humanity. It is impossible to understand anything of what was happening in France in September 1939, writes General Buffer, without referring again to the events of Munich. It is impossible to talk about the essence of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact if you take away from the general situation, if you do not take into account all that preceded it. General Beaufort, who was a member of the military delegation sent to Moscow in August 1939 to sign the Anglo-French-Soviet military agreement, has every reason to talk about what happened in Munich. On August 19, 1939, Soviet, French, and British military delegations met at the Franz Central House of the Red Army. After the capture of Czechoslovakia, Hitler, using the Danzig dispute as a pretext, threatened to occupy Poland in its entirety. For several months, the situation continuously deteriorated. The Soviet representatives repeatedly raised the question of sending responsible plenipotentiaries to Moscow to create a united front in the face of the new aggression being prepared. The USSR offered to sign an agreement on mutual assistance in the event of a Nazi attack on any state, the guarantors of inviolability of the borders of which are the Allies. This proposal was not supported. France and England continued to act through secondary persons deprived of any authority. Only after much prevarication, preliminary negotiations lasted 5 months. In July 1939, it was decided to send a French-English military delegation to Moscow. Prior to this, on July 13 in Paris, General Gamelin had outlined the range of issues to be discussed with the Soviet delegation. This circle was clearly outlined. In the event of an attack on Poland or Romania, the use of Soviet ground troops was ruled out, but support of Romanian or Polish troops by Allied air power was proposed. The French and British delegations spent a great deal of time assembling. The French delegation travelled first to London. On August 5, the delegations assembled aboard the City of Exeter, an old South African line ship chartered by the Admiralty for the voyage. It took 6 days to reach Leningrad. The British delegation was headed by the old Admiral Drax, who was more suited to the position of administrator of a naval museum than to the post of head of such an important military mission. The head of the French delegation was General Dumont, who was the youngest French general in the army, and all he was credited with was organizing the motor transports during the battle for Verdun. Dumont was certainly a patriot, a man of directness and honesty. August 12 in the Franz CDK Soviet delegation was headed by Marshal Voroshilov and Chief of the General Staff of the Red Army, General Shaposhnikov. At the very beginning of the negotiations, Marshal Voroshilov asked whether the delegations had the authority to sign military agreements. Admiral Drax did not have them. Brave General Dumont was better prepared. Instead of credentials, he had a document stating that he had the right to negotiate on all military issues. A vague wording expressing everything and saying nothing. I do not intend to recount the whole course of the discussion of the questions, but General Beaufort, who took part in this discussion, gives an account of it which I strongly advise you to read. Among other things, he writes, Voroshilov renews the attempt. I would like a clear answer. I did not speak of concentrations. I would like to know the opinion of the French and British staffs about actions in case of aggression against Poland and Romania. Can the Soviet troops come into contact with the enemy in East Prussia? The precondition is the passage of Soviet troops, Poland and Romania. Having solved this problem, we can discuss all other questions. Without this, if the Soviet troops must remain in place, it will be difficult to reach a basic agreement. Your opinion is that Poland and Romania will turn to us for help. I am not sure that this will be the case. They may turn to the USSR for help, or they may not do so, or they may do so too late. In that case, the USSR will not be able to provide assistance under conditions useful to the Allies. A meeting of the three great powers represented at our level should form a definite opinion on this question. If Romania and Poland do not ask for help or ask too late, their forces will be defeated, and it is necessary to use these forces. England, France, and the USSR are not interested in defeating them. I insist that first of all it is necessary to discuss the question of the passage of Soviet troops through Poland and Romania. This is the main thing. After such an attack, there was nothing left but to close the meeting, which was done. During the break, Admiral Drax addressing one of the negotiators, "It seems to me that our mission is over." It came to the point that in this way it was seriously intended to obtain the assistance of the Russians without even settling these, also quite legitimate, questions. In response to the policy of procrastination of the French and British missions, the Soviet military mission, in a 5-point memorandum, stated, "The Soviet mission has not forgotten and does not forget that Poland and Romania are sovereign states. On the contrary, as a consequence of this position, the Soviet mission addresses to the French and English missions the question whether Soviet troops would be permitted to enter the Polish and Romanian territories along the corridor in the direction of Vilna, Galicia, and Romania in the event of aggression against France and England or Poland and Romania. This question is all the more legitimate and appropriate since France has a military treaty with Poland, and England has acted as guarantor of the territorial inviolability of Poland and Romania." Beaufort outlined the other 4 points of the memorandum and concluded, "The Soviet reply was characterized by the utmost clarity, and unfortunately for us, by logical irrefutability. It was a pipe dream to seek to negotiate with the USSR without deciding on the question of Soviet-Polish cooperation, at least in terms of strategy. In 1914-1918, British and American troops could not take part in the fighting in France without the consent of our country. Now this was denied to the USSR, which had no common border with Germany. Only one goal was pursued, to send Hitler to... Nevertheless, the USSR until the last moment remained faithful to the principle of collective security, regardless of the advance of the Germans. The German ambassador in Moscow, Schulenburg, telegraphed to Berlin on August 4, 1939, "I have the impression that the Soviet government is ready to sign an agreement with England and France, if the latter accepts Soviet conditions." It was after this, on August 14, that von Ribbentrop proposed his trip to Moscow, and on August 17 he floated the idea of a non-aggression pact. As a result of the failure of the Anglo-French-Soviet negotiations, the USSR and Germany signed a non-aggression pact on August 23, which was ultimately nothing more than a response to what had been signed by the British, French, and von Ribbentrop in 1938, the day after the Munich meeting. Winston Churchill bitterly states in his memoirs, "There can be no doubt, even in the light of subsequent events, that England and France should have agreed to the Russian proposal." But Mr. Chamberlain and the Foreign Office were as if bewitched by a mysterious sphinx. The true position of the French rulers of that time becomes clear from the materials printed in the collaborationist newspaper of Marcel de l'Ivre for November 23, 1940. This issue of the newspaper provides important explanations of Georges Bonnet's views on the causes of the war. Georges Bonnet thought it important to recall the unsuccessful struggle for peace which he had waged right up to the war itself. Only conscious of this, he prepared the negotiations in Munich and signed with von Ribbentrop the Declaration of December 6, 1938. In May 1939, he officially refused to fulfill his obligations under the Franco-Polish Treaty of 1921. In the last days before the war, Georges Bonnet made every effort to have Germany and Poland sign an agreement which would preclude the activation of the Franco-Polish Treaty. After these important clarifications, the reasons for the failure of the Anglo-French-Soviet negotiations in August 1939 become clearer. Roger Surrett, professor of diplomatic history, who lectured at the École Supérieure des Sciences Politiques, and Charles Rousseau, professor at the Sorbonne Law School, in their excellent work Chronology of the World War, published with the assistance of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, thought it possible to write, "The Munich staging, that is, the settlement of the Czech problem by the 4 Western powers behind the back of the USSR, and especially the fact that France and England did not react in any way to the invasion of Czechoslovakia, signify a reorientation in policy. The sudden replacement of Litvinov by Molotov, who had been chairman of the Council of People's Commissars since 1930, made it clear that Moscow would not fall for the new concepts that had emerged in certain circles of the Western powers, the essence of which was that to achieve peace in the West, it would be enough to give free rein to German expansion against Eastern Europe. The failure of Anglo-French-Soviet negotiations and the conclusion of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact will be the inevitable response of the USAR to the policy of freedom of action in the eastern direction. On August 25-26, 1939, this is exactly what I tried to explain to my commander, speaking about the essence of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. Although at that time we did not have any documents on this subject which are now known, my evidence was couched in this spirit. I could see that my interlocutor was deeply interested in this. As I left his office, I recalled a passage from Romain Rolland's novel, The Enchanted Soul, written long before 1930-1939. It was obvious that Europe, and indeed the whole world, was given over to the power of industrial and financial forces that secretly moved the affairs of state. Everything was at their beck and call: democracy, fascism, and the lords of the world would have won the party under two conditions. If they had agreed to divide the world, and also if they had agreed to act together against the only worthy opponent who was preparing his counter-offensive. For the Soviet Union forged in the smoke of trumpets the armour of its great plans. On September 1, Hitler invaded Poland. On September 2, the British government, following the policy of the Polish version of Munich, accepted Mussolini's proposal for a conference of a number of European states. An agreement could not be reached, and at 12 o'clock on September 3, 1939, England declared war on Germany. At 17 o'clock, France followed suit. Speaking of France and England, Hitler stated, "If they have declared war on us, it does not mean that they will oppose us." Peace or war, the policy remained the same, and during the strange war of 1939-1940 once again confirmed the famous position of Clausewitz: war is a continuation of politics by other means. On the Polish front, Hitlerites put into battle 57 divisions, including 6 tank and 8 motorized, with the support of 2,000 aircraft. The Germans were confident that Munich, France, would not lift a finger. On the Western Front, they left only 43 divisions against 84 French and 10 British divisions. While all German aircraft and all tanks were used in Poland, no real offensive action was taken in the West. On September 8, several French formations began to advance in a limited area from the Sajmin area. On the night they reached the Siegfried Line, but then halted and contented themselves with combing through the Varned forest. On October 16, after the first German counterattack, the French troops withdrew to the line from which they had begun the offensive. At this point, the fighting ended. War was declared to help Poland, but not a single shot was fired. The French troops were bogged down in a strange war, a sitting war, as the Germans called it. On the other hand, the real war the rulers waged within their own country against communists, anti-fascists, labourers. All plans were not directed against Hitler, but to turn the conflict into a war against the USSR. General de Gaulle, in his memoirs, wrote, "It must be said that certain circles considered Stalin rather than Hitler as their enemy. They showed concern mainly about the accumulation of forces to defeat Russia, then assisting Finland, then bombing Baku, then the landing in Istanbul rather than the defeat of the Reich." After the declaration of war, the 3rd Colonial Artillery Regiment marched from Gwanja to the front. I was assigned to the 3rd Battery, where I met my friends. Together with some of my comrades, I explained to the soldiers the meaning of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. One day on September 17, when, as usual, we were returning in groups of 10 from the camp kitchen to the battery location, the soldiers turned to me. "Did you hear the radio? The Russians have taken Poland. Now you see that the Germans and the Russians are allies, and that's not at all what you're telling us." As far as I remember, we gathered in the barn at that time. It was a real rally at which I made a speech. I talked about the French rulers' policy of non-interference in Spanish affairs, about Munich and the Franco-German Pact, and then about the German-Soviet non-aggression pact. "So 2 weeks now?" I said. "We have been in a state of so-called war, the purpose of which is to defend Poland. And what have we done? Krakow was taken on September 6th. Since the 9th, the Germans have been in Warsaw. Only the Russians put their army forward and told Hitler, 'We won't let you go any further.' When I was 17 years old, I held meetings more than once. Nowhere before had I witnessed such a radical change in the views of those present as here in Juan. And yet we did not have then the historical facts that we have now. The Soviet troops reached the Curzon Line. named after the Foreign Secretary of England, which was the initial frontier established on December 8, 1919, on the basis of the principles formulated by Wilson. According to these principles, all territories with a Polish-speaking population were then included in Poland. During the Russian-Polish War of 1920, Soviet troops under the command of Marshal Tukhachevsky reached Warsaw, and then, according to the Treaty of Riga, were withdrawn back on March 18, 1921. The border was moved to the east. Poland received territories inhabited by Ukrainians and Belarusians, who in the new dictatorial state of Marshal Pilsudski, and after him, Colonel Beck, became an oppressed minority. In 1939, the Western Belarusians reunited with Soviet Belarus, of which they had been a part until 1914, and the Western Ukrainians returned to the fold of Soviet Ukraine. The USSR used the respite created by the Non-Aggression Pact to strengthen its borders to effectively repel Hitler's impending aggression. Who can argue today that if the USSR had not entered the western regions of Ukraine and Belarusia, which were part of Poland, in 1939, Moscow could have survived in 1941, and defeat would have been a serious blow not only to the Soviet Union, but to all the nations fighting Hitler. Later, the border was moved away from the city of Leningrad, which at that time was at a distance of a cannon shot from the Finnish side. The Soviet Union offered the Finnish government to exchange territories to ensure the safety of Leningrad. A categorical refusal was received in response. After heavy winter fighting from November 30, 1939 to March 7, 1940, Finland ceded the Karelian Isthmus and leased the Hanko Peninsula for 30 years, receiving 8 million Finnish marks annually. These measures were decisive in 1941, when Nazi and Finnish forces attempted to capture Leningrad. Finally, the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, which had been torn away from the USA after the 1914-1918 war, joined the USSR. The pro-fascist rulers of these countries were overthrown. On July 2, 1940, with the consent of the Romanian government, Bessarabia and Bukovina were returned to the Soviet Union, which had been torn away from it by the Treaty of Paris of October 28, 1920, and which the USA had been demanding for 20 years. After Hitler's troops attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, they had to fight for the possession of all these lands. The USSR actively carried out measures aimed at accelerated strengthening of its military potential. The whole country was preparing to repulse aggression. The USSR knew that it would have to fight almost alone against the German army, fed on the flesh of its victims, relying on the industrial and agricultural power of all Europe. The Soviet Union's military appropriations for fiscal year 1941, approved in 1940, amounted to 43.4% of the nation's total budget. In 1939, 9 aircraft factories and 7 engine factories were built. The factories produced new types of tanks and airplanes, and although the famous Katyusha Guards mortars were first used in the Battle of Smolensk, the Russians had them as early as June 1941. By this time, the Soviet Army had 17,745 combat aircraft, of which 3,719 were of new types. In March 1941, it was decided to form 20 mechanized corps. Marshal Zhukov noted in his memoirs that they were to have 16,600 tanks of new models out of 32,000 tanks in service. By the beginning of the war, June 22, half of the tanks had already been produced, and the rest were produced in the second period of the war at the expense of the envisaged strategic reserves. On May 5, 1941, Stalin addressed the students of the Red Army academies at a reception in honor of the graduates. "You will come to the units from the capital. To you, Red Army soldiers and commanders will ask the questions. What is happening now? Why is France defeated? Why is England defeated and Germany victorious? Is the German army really invincible?" The military thought of the German army is moving forward. The army is armed with the latest technology, trained in new techniques of warfare, gained a lot of experience. It is a fact that Germany has the best army both in technique and organization. But the Germans in vain believe that their army is ideal, invincible. There are no invincible armies. Germany will not succeed under the slogans of invasive, conquering wars, under the slogans of conquest of other countries, subjugation of other peoples and states. France's big capital showed indecision, and on May 10, 1940, when Hitler struck westward, there was a complete collapse. Even now, many are asking the question, How could it be that such a strong army was destroyed in less than 6 weeks? When a nation like France allows the victor to dictate its laws to itself after only a few weeks of fighting, then it is quite impossible to explain such a rout by military reasons alone. Indeed, the army and strategy were based on our politics. A serious mistake was the refusal to launch an offensive at the beginning of September 1939. A second mistake, due my personal opinion, was to create the situation which developed during the invasion of Belgium in May 1940. In the foreground were deep political reasons, affecting the whole strategy of the war in 1939-1940. Many in the government and at headquarters had already decided to give the country to Hitler. The deputy de Quirilis, who is in no way suspected of communist sympathies, wrote, "At a time when the anti-communist delirium had reached a critical point and passed into a form of hysteria, it was now, in the midst of the war with Germany, that even the very thought of the danger of Hitlerism was completely buried." On June 8, General de Gaulle met with General Weygand at the Château de Montreuil. In his memoirs, he cites this conversation. "Now you see," said the commander-in-chief, "I was not mistaken in informing you a few days ago that the Germans would launch an offensive on the Somme River on June 6. They are actually advancing. At this moment they are crossing the river. I can't counteract that. I'll allow it. They cross the Somme. What's next? Then the Seine and the Marne. Well, what's beyond that? What's beyond that? But that's the end. How? The end? What about the whole world? And the empire?" General Weygand laughed bitterly. Empire. But that is childish. As for the whole world, when I am defeated here, not a week will pass as England will begin negotiations with the Reich." The commander-in-chief, looking at me point blank, added, "If I could be sure that the Germans would give me the necessary forces to maintain order." In these tragic times, only one preoccupation haunted certain circles at headquarters, Pétain and a few others: how to give up the country before the people revolted. Contrary to firmly held opinion, we actually had an army capable of resistance. Sure, it could have been more modern, more motorized and mechanized, had more planes. Well, what was said about it was not true. General Ferrer carefully counted the number of armoured assets of both the Germans and the Allies. The Nazis had 3,851 vehicles at their disposal, 3,003 tanks of 5 types, including Skoda tanks, as well as 848 other armoured vehicles. Though the French and British together had 4,368 vehicles, and 68 tanks and 600 other armoured vehicles. In reality, only a fraction of this equipment was used in mechanized divisions, because tanks are not everything. They need air cover and interaction with other branches of the army, infantry, artillery, engineers, etc. In 1940, at the front, infantry armed with carbines were thrown into battle against German tanks, and later the Nazis were surrendered large batches of brand new tanks, which were in the rear bases and barracks. First people were surrendered, then weapons. On May 10, 1940, some of our planes were destroyed on the airfields. The war was declared as early as September 3, 1939. 8 months had passed since its beginning. There was no question of any suddenness. Those who intended in Saint-Exupéry, those who intended on May 10 to take to the air to save their planes, did not have the opportunity to fly, because it was forbidden by the headquarters. The preface to Paul Bourbon and Bernard Eislin's book Tanks Crossing the Meuse states, "The defeat of France in 1940 was an extraordinary event. We now know that the Franco-English forces had superiority in tanks and artillery, and were not so inferior in airplanes that it could portend such a rapid collapse. We know that if a French soldier goes into battle under normal conditions under firm command, he will fulfill his military duty to the end, even in a hopeless situation. Betrayed Austria, betrayed Czechoslovakia, betrayed Poland, betrayed their own country. This was the logical consequence of a policy of betrayal that opened the way to collaborationism. But it didn't mean the death of the country. Another France was rising. It was the end of June. The weather was fine, and we had to take advantage of it to make a new escape attempt at all costs. I had formed a friendship with 2 communists who, like myself, had made an unsuccessful escape. They were Raymond Petronin from the Haute-Savoie department and Pierre Fournaille, a clockworker from the ex-arrondissement of Paris. During our time together in the barracks for fugitives, we found out that most of the unsuccessful escapees were apprehended on the approaches to the border, which the Nazis guarded especially closely. We planned to get money, buy 3 railroad tickets to the border station, then try to cross the Swiss border on a difficult mountain route. In the meantime, we had to make an escape from the camp. When at the beginning of July they began to recruit volunteers among the prisoners to work in some kind of team, the 3 of us immediately declared our consent. We were transferred to a small camp on the Danube near Krems. There, 2 or 3 brand new wooden barracks were prepared for us, surrounded by a double row of barbed wire. Unlike the concentration camp, there were no watchtowers, but a sentry stood guard at the entrance 24 hours a day. There were fewer of us than in Wales, and our job was to unload timber from barges on the Danube. We worked for a riverman, a Hungarian by nationality. His name was Mustas. "Why do they call you that?" "It's a French name." We once asked him, "I'm probably a descendant of one of Napoleon's soldiers," he replied. It is not known what his name was, but he must have had a beautiful moustache. That is why, when a son was born to him in Hungary, he was named Mustas. Having said this, he laughed loudly. I do not vouch for the linguistic and etymological accuracy of the origin of this name, but the one to whom it belonged was a proud and very handsome man. We quickly became friends with Moustache and began to sell him German camp blankets, especially since we did not need them in July. Every morning one of us would bring a blanket under our work blouse and sell it to Moustache, who would pay 3 or 4 marks apiece. The trade was going well. The escape was scheduled for about August 15, and by that time we intended to have collected the money necessary to buy tickets and necessary things. On the evening of July 25, however, our plans changed abruptly. Returning from work, we saw that a new party of workers had arrived. Among them was a Yugoslav communist who spoke French quite well. He informed us that an underground organization had been set up in the camp, and that on July 26, 800 soldiers, veterans of the First World War, would be repatriated from Camp 17B by rail. We immediately made the decision. Such unforeseen good fortune could not be avoided. Despite the searches, we managed to sneak in and hide some of our civilian clothes, particularly overalls, under a straw bale. We had one last event to perform, to shave off our long beards. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening. We waited for the appointed hour, watching carefully. Suddenly my Polish friend approached us. "Give me your clogs, take my leather cravats with lambskin," he whispered. "This is my personal gift. Also here is a loaf of bread for 3 of you. It's the Polish group's supplies." I looked at him in surprise, and he immediately added, "All 3 of you have shaved?" "We realized at once that you were going to run away. Let me help you." One has only to imagine what moral and material support and assistance it was for us. Between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning, dressed in civilian clothes, we silently climbed out the window, taking a blanket to throw over the barbed wire fence. The darkness hid us from the sentry's eyes, and we made it safely through 2 rows of barbed wire. We believed that the Nazis, forced to use all their means of transportation on the Soviet-German front, would surely provide French wagons for the transportation of 800 repatriates. Knowing the punctuality of the Germans and Austrians, we hoped that the echelon would be ready for departure exactly on the specified day. To get to the station, we had to go to the railroad and walk along it for several kilometers. Indeed, soon we found ourselves on the railway line Vienna-Ypres, walked along it for 2 or 3 kilometers. Several tens of meters we had to crawl, so that we would not be noticed from the lighted windows of some lonely house. But here is the sorting station of the Cream railway station. On the tracks we could see freight cars everywhere, but that was not what we needed. At last we found an echelon of 15 to 18 passenger cars with inscriptions in French. The question now arose as to how to get into it unobserved. We had brought ropes with us, expecting to tie ourselves with them under the bogies of the 2-axle wagons in case of need. This method, however, was fraught with a number of dangers. Some of the prisoners who used it were killed on the way. Besides, if we had to spend the whole day under the cars of an echelon standing at the station, we could be discovered by some of the railroad workers. When discussing these matters in the barracks, some comrades talked about partitions in the railroad car toilets that could be moved. We were assured that 1 person could fit between the partitions. We examined the entire train without success. This method turned out to be unacceptable. After carefully examining the interior of the cars, we finally found what we needed. If we crawled under a bench and pressed our backs against the partitions separating adjacent compartments, We could not be seen even by a man of small stature. By 4 o'clock in the morning we were seated, each in his own compartment. We could hear all the usual sounds of the station. We could hear how the freight cars were being hitched up, how the railroaders were talking among themselves. Suddenly I heard a steady snore from the neighbouring compartment. I crawled to the sleeper. It turned out to be my friend Pierre Fournet. "You're crazy. Do whatever you want, but don't sleep." Several hours passed. At the beginning of the afternoon, an Austrian railroader came to do the cleaning and began to open the window curtains in the cars. In our car, he swept the floor in the aisles and under the benches with a broom. At one point, his rough shoes were a few centimetres from my face, and I held my breath. The waiting was becoming heavy, unbearable. The locomotive had not yet arrived. Are we on the right train? The more time passed, the more questions I asked myself. Finally, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, a distant rumbling sounded, loud voices were heard. A minute more, and the doors slammed. All the compartments were filled with people. Words in French were exchanged with each other, and they were shoving packages and homemade wooden suitcases into the luggage nets. They couldn't fit everything in there, and the grocery bags flew under the benches. The man sitting above me grumbled, "You can't put anything under the benches because of those damned radiators." By a sharp jolt, we realized that the locomotive was hitched up, and soon the echelon moved. We had intended to hide under the benches until the train arrived in France, fearing that there would be collaborators among the repatriates. The train travelled fast, stopping only on schedule. Above me sat my brothers in captivity, who had been separated from their loved ones for 13 months. Joyfully excited by their return, they talked without ceasing. At one of the stops I heard one of the repatriates, who had evidently been on the platform, say, "Nins." I remembered the camp in Wells, a few kilometres away, and thought of my battery comrades who had stayed there. All my thoughts were with them. At that time another repatriate from a neighbouring compartment entered the compartment and whispered excitedly, "We have a fugitive in our compartment. It is obvious from everything that he is not a veteran of the First World War. He is no more than 25 years old. The Germans are looking in all compartments. They'll see him and grab him." After a little thought, I decided to come out of my hole, for the escape of all three was in danger of being jeopardized. My appearance from under the bench caused confusion in the compartment. After the excitement caused by this surprise had subsided, I told them that there were 2 other fugitives in the train, and then invited Pierre Fournet and Raymond Petronin into the compartment. We were able to make a quick arrangement with the passengers of the 3 compartments. They began to go out into the corridor one by one to give us a chance to sit and rest. Just before dawn, we took our places under the benches again, having given our word not to show our faces again. In the evening, the echelon arrived at its destination, Chalon-sur-Marne. We agreed on arrival to act in the same order as on departure. To wait until the prisoners to be repatriated and the German soldiers accompanying them came out, and to get off the train only when the train would be taken to an alternate track. Everything went according to the plan. As soon as the repatriates disembarked, the German soldiers made a cursory inspection, and then they were replaced by 2 French railroad workers. Talking, they went into every compartment and collected scraps of bread in buckets, converted from large tin cans. For about another hour, we stayed in the hiding places. When only the distant noise of the station could be heard, we got out of the carriage. More than 13 months had passed since we had been taken prisoner. Naturally, we knew nothing of the moods of the French. Outside the station boundary, we saw a switch near which some railroad man was working. We decided to trust him, but were ready to flee if he tried to give us away. "We are escaped prisoners of war. We came by train from Austria," we told the railroad man. He treated us very warmly, and a brief conversation with him showed that he was a worthy representative of that fine organization of railwaymen which had shown itself so brilliantly during the whole 4 years of the occupation. "Yeah," he said, "no one will give you away. Everyone will help you. Now we must quickly find you a place to sleep. Curfew is at 23 o'clock, and you may be detained by German patrols." When we asked him where to go, he showed us the direction with his hand. "There is a village a few kilometers from here. Any house will take you in for the night." We walked almost to the end of the village, immersed in sleep. This small place is called Fagnes, and knocked on one of the houses on the outskirts. In it lived Henry Girard, a railroader who worked at the station in Chalon. Half asleep, he looked out of the window. "Anything. Who are you?" "Open up, we'll explain everything." We told him we'd escaped from the concentration camp. Without a second's hesitation, Gerard let us in. "You must be hungry," he said, and without waiting for our answer he brought ham, bread, cheese, a bottle of wine, and even prepared an omelette. At that time, as we learned later, it was a real royal meal for us and for many Frenchmen. Subsequently, I had the pleasure of meeting Henry Gerard on more than one occasion. We were not the first and not the last escaped prisoners he helped. Very often, when travelling, he hid one or two fugitives in the baggage car. In the morning, Henry Gerard showed us how to get off at the Chalon-Troyes highway. My wife, Cécile Romagan, and her relatives lived at Saint-Julien-les-Villa, a suburb of Troyes. On the highway, we travelled on foot for a while, and then we stopped a truck. "We are escaped prisoners. We need to get to Troyes." "Go. Get in." The words escaped prisoners were becoming truly magical. The driver we met now was Noël, later to become a valiant member of the resistance movement. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The car stopped at Saint-Pas-au-Tertre. It's a small village on the outskirts of Troyes. Noël invited us into his home, insisted that we dine with his family, taking money of 100 francs each. We were deeply moved by the warm friendship and solidarity of a switchman from Chalon, a trackman from Fenières, a driver from the suburbs of Troyes. Yes, it was possible to wage an anti-fascist struggle in occupied France. In Saint-Julien, my friends stayed in the small forest of Château de Cour to wait for me to visit my home. My father-in-law, Maurice Romagon, had built the house by taking advantage of Lusher's law. Before the declaration of war, he had just finished paying the annual instalments for it. Now the shutters of the windows and the wicket of the lattice fence were closed. A neighbour from across the street saw me and came to the threshold of the house. "What do you wish? They don't live here now. They left about a month ago." I was wearing overalls and a cap like the German dockers wear. Before the war, these caps were called Telmanki, after the leader of the German Communist Party, a former docker. The woman was unfamiliar to me, and I introduced myself to her as an electrician who had come to receive money for a job. "In that case," she said, "go to Renée Romagan. She will give you the address or pay you." Renée Romagan, Cécile's sister-in-law, daughter of the Italian anti-fascist de Zainin, worked in a textile factory in Troyes. She was a party activist. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, the three of us arrived at the small house where my wife's sister-in-law lived. Renée informed me that my father-in-law, a Troyes county councillor, had been arrested and imprisoned in Clairvaux prison on October 10, 1940. My brother-in-law, Pierre Romagan, Renée's husband, had recently been arrested. Cécile and her mother, Mama Edwidge, to avoid imminent arrest, had to leave. I was very fond of my father-in-law Maurice Romagon, although I only saw him a few times. Maurice was the epitome of kindness, honesty, unwavering loyalty to his ideal, to his party. He survived the difficult years between the two wars, the economic crisis, the repression of businessmen. He joined the French Communist Party as soon as it was founded and was an active party organizer. Unemployment and repression were increasing, and despite his high professional qualifications, he became unemployed and then became a peddler. He enjoyed great prestige in the town and was elected as a county councillor. Even his political opponents respected him for his honesty and unbounded devotion to his ideal. In 1939, the secretary of the party organization of the Department of Aube, Jean Flavian, was drafted into the army. In the local party organization remained only those who were less than 20 years old and those who had an exemption from military service. Maurice Romagon became secretary of the party organization of the Aube department. Soon the communists had to go underground. Maurice was first arrested in March 1940 by those who waged war more against the people than against Hitler. On October 10, 1940, he was picked up a second time by Commissar Brunet and his like, who continued their anti-communist activities to please the Nazis. In March 1940, Maurice was thrown into prison as a German agent and 7 months later as an enemy of Germany, all done by the same police officers. Edwidge and Cécile were themselves in an illegal situation and had no opportunity to visit him in Clairvaux prison. Pierre Romagan was arrested along with 12 other party activists in the Aube department in June 1941. From the prison in Troyes, he was sent to the Campine camp and from there to the Sachsenhausen-Oranienburg concentration camp. In 1945, when Pierre returned from there, he looked more like his shadow than himself. Pierre Romagon died in 1958 at the age of 44, a consequence, of course, of the abuse he endured for more than 3 years in Hitler's death camps.